Welcome, everybody. We are once again just a cavalcade of stars this week. And for this morning, morning everywhere, unless we've got folks who are on the other side of the world, which we've had, so maybe, but morning. We are really lucky to have Dr. Shantel Meek, the director of the Children's Equity Project. I'm not going to read you her bio. I'll tell you, my friend Shantel here is a doer, and what I mean by that is Shantel doesn't sit around and wait until somebody says maybe this would be a good idea. She demands change, pushes policy change, and really leads efforts around children's equity in this country in many ways, and really has put out some of the seminal documents over the last few years and been a leader in this field for quite some time. I'm honored that she's been a part of our Center of Excellence since the beginning, and really feel honored that she's willing to share the next hour with us. So I don't want to take too much of your time, Shantel. I'm going to turn it over to you. Go off camera. I'm here if you need me, which no one ever does. So you take it away.
Thank you, Neil. So honored to be with you all today, and so pleased to be asked to share this hour with you. If you give me one quick second, I'm going to share my screen. So let's get started. As Neil mentioned, I run the Children's Equity Project, which is a national initiative housed at Arizona State University, but really led in partnership with universities and other nonprofits across the country, with really one central goal, and that is to change policy, to change systems, to advance equity for our youngest children. We do most of our work in early care and education, and into the early grades, into the K-12 system, but we also do some work in adjacent systems, in immigration systems as they affect young children. We certainly do a lot of work in mental health with our partners at Georgetown and others, and on health equity, et cetera. So I'm going to be focusing today on systems level and policy change. I know that we have heard over the course of the conference some really, really amazing presentations, some really amazing reflections. A lot of it centered on equity, and a lot of it centered on kind of the process of equity, people's journeys, organizational journeys, self-reflection, to really begin to embody and act on equity within our professional roles. Today, we're going to have a little bit of that, and really a focus on policy, really a focus on systems, really a focus on how mental health consultation systems and mental health consultants can be agents of change and a bigger policy and systems change, and should be in the job description, that should be in the systems description of what we are aiming to do, and walk you through one of the Children's Equity Project's frameworks on equitable systems, and then kind of how mental health consultants and mental health consultation systems and managers and everybody that's within the system can help us get to those goals in hopefully some really concrete and measurable ways. But before I do that, if you have sat in on any of the CEP's Center of Excellence webinars, you are quite familiar with this metaphor. And if you have not, this is for you. But we're just going to walk through this really briefly because I think it really sets the tone for shifting our mindsets to thinking about systems and thinking about policy. So I'm going to take just a quick minute to walk us through this. So imagine, close your eyes. You are walking through a field of beautiful green grass. It's a beautiful sunny day. The sun is shining. You feel the warmth on your skin, and you come across a lake. And you look in the lake and you're admiring the beautiful water and the sun shimmering and on the lake and the water. And you see, you look down and you see that a fish is belly up. Well, at that point, you might start hypothesizing, right, about what happened to that fish. You might guess that it might have eaten something weird that it shouldn't have eaten. It might have got caught in a fishing hook. It might have had some kind of disease or gotten sick. But you'd be probably formulating hypotheses, wondering what happened to the fish. And then you kind of look up and you walk around the lake a little bit and you notice that there's another dead fish and another fish that's belly up and another, and pretty soon you kind of start to assess the situation and see that about half of the fish in the lake are belly up. So at that point, you probably wouldn't go around forming hypotheses about what happened to each individual fish. You would probably start wondering what happened to the water in the lake that is making all of these fish sick. So imagine you then continue walking, you come across another lake and you see the same pattern. Half of the fish in that lake are belly up. And then you walk to another lake, right, in the same field, and half of the fish in that lake are belly up. Well, at that point, you would probably stop hypothesizing about what's wrong with the water in each individual lake. And you would probably start wondering what's wrong with the groundwater that is feeding all of the lakes, that is making all of these fish go belly up and making them sick and die. And so that is one way that we kind of think about systems, right? Each lake is an individual system, and we're seeing similar patterns of disparities across race kind of consistently and across other demographic characteristics as well, where often we are trying to figure out what's happening with this fish instead of, or in isolation of, really also thinking about what's going on in the water of this lake, and then what is going on with the groundwater that is feeding all of these lakes. And so as we start to kind of walk through, we're going to come back to early childhood specifically, and a mental health consultation specifically, just kind of think through your role and the role of mental health consultation at each of those levels, right? At the fish level, it's certainly critical and important and urgent work. At the lake level and at the groundwater level. So in December of 2020, we published a report in partnership with a whole host of national organizations that laid out 14 priorities to advance equity in early care and education systems. And kind of a grounding piece of that report was a definition that we use to describe equitable systems. And this definition is kind of a framing that we've carried with us, and that influences how we think about policy and where we put our strategic priorities. I'm just going to read it out loud for folks. Equitable learning systems provide access to resources, opportunities, and experiences to children and families that result in positive outcomes that are not associated with children's demographic characteristics. They actively and continuously identify and intentionally eliminate manifestations of systemic racism and other forms of oppression. So when we look at this kind of description of what an equitable system might look like, there are three dimensions that I want us to walk away from. The first is access. So an equitable system has equitable access. Two, an equitable system has and promotes positive experiences for young children and families. And an equitable system results in outcomes that are not associated with demographic characteristics. So we're breaking the link between demography and destiny. And those are the three pieces that we focus on: access, experiences, and outcomes. So we're going to dig into those in 1 second. So we don't have the time to go into all 14 of the priorities that we lay out in the report. But I did want to give you all a sense of what they are and kind of how wide-ranging they are in our work as advocates, in our work as agents for change in communities and at the state level and at the national level. So it starts with how we disseminate our resources. So who is getting money and how much money are they getting? And not just money, but services, right? Consultation and other services. How are we allocating those resources equitably? How are we defining need? Two, looking at authentic integration and how we are really promoting authentic integration. Three, ensuring accountability, right? So often one of the huge problems in policy, right, is that there is not an expectation and therefore there is not accountability for providing equitable access, positive experiences, and outcomes that are not associated with demographic characteristics. That's just not an expectation. It's often not monitored. It's often not a condition for funding, and there's often no accountability for completely ignoring it. So really ensuring that there is an accountability system in place that keeps us all accountable for promoting equity across the line. Certainly professional development, right? Centering equity in professional preparation and development. And that is a huge role of what mental health consultation can do in helping prepare and continuously develop the knowledge base, the capacity of the early care and education workforce, and of course, the workforce of all of the other different systems that mental health consultants work in. Really thinking about quality rating systems and embedding equity very explicitly in those, and we'll be publishing something on that very soon. Looking at culturally affirming pedagogy and curriculum, embedding equity in quality measurement, eliminating harsh discipline. That's certainly a topic that we talk a lot about in mental health consultation circles. That's certainly a topic that I know has been a topic of discussion within the conference, and that we'll talk a lot about. But it is not the only topic. It is an important point to make. 10 is really thinking about equity for children with disabilities and what that looks like, right? I think that is another area, another huge area where mental health consultation can play a huge role, right? In the inclusion of kids with disabilities. They can facilitate the inclusion of children with disabilities in general early childhood programs, which is a place where as a nation, we are woefully lacking, which you all, I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. It's implementing equitable continuous quality improvement, right? We talk about CQI a lot in this field. We talk about using data to make decisions and then making changes to our, our practice or our policy based on those data. But we don't often infuse equity into it, right? We don't often think about how the inputs, right, that are going in to our system may be different for children who look different, right? For a white child versus a Black child versus a dual language learner versus a child with a disability. And how our outputs, we don't often measure how our outputs should be disaggregated, right? And use that to inform change with equity at the center specifically. Family leadership and family partnerships and family engagement. I don't think this is one that we have to spend a lot of time in with this group, because you all as folks who are working closely with providers, with families, with teachers, with kids, with other folks in the system know how critical and fundamental really the family piece is. Ensuring we're prioritizing family childcare as a key part of the system that is often overlooked and under-resourced, and expanding access to bilingual learning. We'll talk a little bit more about dual language learners in a minute. But these are kind of the 14 priorities that we've laid out. And within these priorities, if you look at the report, there are very specific recommendations to Congress, to federal agencies, and to states to help advance all of these. And I think mental health consultants really have a role in working toward all of these across all levels, wherever we operate, right? Whether that's at a community level, whether that's at a program or city level, whether that's at the state level, a really important part of the work that we do. So now I kind of want to switch, or not switch, just drill down a little bit more and think about mental health consultation specifically in creating equitable systems for kids and families, and really thinking through together how we move to systemic change. It's not surprising coming from us at the CEP that it's measurable action and that there's accountability tied to it, right? Like all of these things are required for systemic change. So I'm going to go through kind of the access, experiences, and outcomes with mental health consultation across these different pieces. So access. So let's think about access. Access to mental health consultation, access to early care and education, access to resources and services for young children in general. So what does the system look like today? What does our access look like today? We know that there are many sources of research and data that find that there's inequitable access to high quality early education. We know that there is inequitable funding for programs and services that serve historically marginalized communities. We know that Head Start has never been fully funded. We know that IDEA has never been fully funded. We know that Title I and Title III of the education law, which serve children in low-income communities and English learners, have been woefully underfunded. And we know all of these funding streams, although they exist, have been barely funded to serve a fraction of the eligible population, or serve the whole population, but with inadequate quantity of services and dosage of services. And so, we know that there's research. The Education Trust published a report a couple years ago that found that I think only 1% and 4% of Black and Latino children, Latino and Black children respectively, have access to high quality pre-K. We also know that there is research that finds that childcare providers serving Black and Brown children are more likely to be rated lower in QRIS. And because a lot of our state systems fund providers or reimburse providers based on where they fall on the QRIS system, it's called tiered quality rating and improvement systems, they get less money. So providers who are serving Black and Brown children may be rated lower, but then they are reimbursed at a lower rate, which kind of perpetuates this cycle, right, of under-resourcing the folks who are serving and providing services and resources to our Black and Brown children or to other communities of color. So now, let's think specifically about mental health consultation, right? What is your role in all of these issues that we have with access? In all of this inequitable distribution of resources that we have in this country, including in our very own systems in which we operate, early care and education, home visiting, certainly, healthcare, we know that there are disparities. So who has access to mental health consultation, right? What communities are you serving? And how do you pick the communities that you're serving? Does dosage or does quality look different in different communities? What factors do you consider when you expand? So we know that there's been expansion of mental health consultation in several states. We've seen it in Arkansas and Ohio and several other places over the last several years. What factors are we considering when we expand? Like, where do we decide where we go next and who gets access to services next? And how do we make those determinations? And are we considering historical marginalization, historical inequities that have a stream and continue today when we decide where we go next? How are we defining need? And how are we advocating for more services in the communities that have been historically left behind, historically to have less resources? So when we think about access, right, we think about early care and education, we think about the other systems in which mental health consultants work, really start thinking about how are we deciding who gets the services? We know mental health consultation works. We know there is a really robust evidence base. I know that you heard from Dr. Shivers already that talked a little bit about the equity pieces with respect to the effects and benefits of mental health consultation, but none of that matters if it's not getting to the places where it needs to get. And so when we sit down and we map out where we go next and how we expand or where we are providing services, it's worth thinking through all of these pieces with that equity lens. So I'm going to ask my colleague Crystal to read some of these out loud, but I would love to hear if you could share in the chat, what are some concrete actions you engage in to ensure equitable access to mental health consultation? What are some concrete actions you engage in to expand access to high quality early childhood services in the community in general in which you work? So I'm going to give folks a minute to formulate some thoughts and then share some ideas in the chat, and hopefully Crystal can help us out and read some of those out loud if they come in.
Great, happy to help, Shantel. So it looks like on the live stream, there's a little delay, and so everyone is now seeing the instructions to share in the chat. I'm happy to read a couple that are coming up right now. It says, in Alabama, our school system funding is linked to community property taxes. So we start off in a difficult spot, to say the least. Someone else said, these historical inequities have created an atmosphere of distrust. Folks may be still popping in their concrete actions. So we'll go ahead and wait a bit more. We'll read a few. Amy responded to Mandy from Alabama, and she said that's similar in California too. It creates a very difficult situation. All right, we have a few responses. Sherry Heller says, prioritize centers that take child care assistance for IE CMHC. Diane Harkins says, hiring bilingual mental health consultants. Having bilingual providers who are from the community. Sandy says, we use the early development index data to determine priority in Orange County. And we'll take two more. Folks are agreeing that the property tax link creates a challenge. And then we'll take this last one. Allison Heart Garden says, Colorado recently launched an online referral and ECMH support line available in multiple languages. Bilingual providers are using interpreters with every session at no cost to families. And last one, Glenda says, we contract with local community mental health agencies to provide consultation services to our centers. So I feel like we have a few more coming in the chat, but if there's another session to chime in, we can keep that going.
Yeah, thank you so much, Crystal. And thank you everyone for such meaningful engagement. Property taxes and local funding is certainly a huge equity issue that there's been a lot written about. And, you know, a lot of the federal funding for education is supposed to compensate through some of these supplemental funding streams for high poverty districts and for children learning English. But as we mentioned before, right, they're woefully insufficient. They don't make up the difference. And we still see huge inequities. Education Trust also publishes a report every few years looking at the difference in funding for schools who serve majority white versus majority of color schools. And they find that there is, in many states, a significant difference where schools, primarily white schools, are getting more public money than schools that serve children of color in several states. So certainly a challenge. So let's move on to experiences. And this is kind of a lot of where the bread and butter of mental health consultation is really crafting and improving the experiences of children within the settings in which they're receiving services, right? So let's talk a little bit about what our system looks like today, what the challenges are today. We know that there is uneven quality, right? Across the board, doesn't matter how you define quality, right? We know that there are physical infrastructure differences where children of color and low-income children are more likely to learn in buildings that are physically less safe, more presented with toxins, unsafe drinking water, like just across the board. We know that there's a lot more renovation and construction in high-income districts that keep buildings, you know, safe and toxin-free and secure and appealing and a place where you want to be and where you can, you know, facilitate, enable learning. We know that there's differences in ratios and class size. We know that there are differences in the process quality, right? The big topic of and category of process quality, which is a lot of where your work comes in, right? In like the teacher-child relationship, we know that Dr. Iruka and other scholars have certainly published on the fact that Black and brown boys in particular have less close and more conflictual relationships with teachers. And so across the board, we see that quality is uneven. We know, as we've talked about already, that harsh discipline is disproportionate, specifically Black children across every metric, across every state, across any which way that you look at it. They are overrepresented in harsh discipline. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. Children with disabilities often also overrepresented, and Indigenous children also overrepresented in some, depending on which data and age group you're looking at. We know that English is often the default, right? Which puts dual language learners and anybody who is not a native English speaker, who doesn't speak it at home, at a disadvantage right off the bat, because we know it takes time to acquire that. So acquire English. And so if you're coming to school and we're immersing you in English, you're missing out on content, right? And so you are automatically disadvantaged. And we know that that is still the default in the vast majority of early care and education systems. We know that with young children in particular, right? A toddler, a baby, a child who is just developing language, right? We're putting them in this environment where they're understood, they're embraced, they're responded to at home. And then we put them in an environment where they're no longer understood, they're developing words. And you can't be as responsive because you don't quite know what they're saying, right? Because there's a language barrier there. And so how do we, you know, the linguistic diversity of the workforce is really key here, but that language piece is a huge inequity. We know that positive racial socialization is not a focus, and we know that culturally affirming curriculum, pedagogy, and all these pieces are uneven. And they certainly do not center around the experiences of Black children, of Latino children, of Indigenous children, and of others. So we know that across the board, however we look at quality, right, it's uneven. And the experiences that children have when they walk into an early care and education setting or other services, early childhood services, are not the same. So let's talk a little bit about the experiences of kids with disabilities in particular, right? So we know that there's lots and lots of research over lots and lots of decades that finds that high quality inclusion provides a host of benefits for kids with disabilities and for kids without disabilities. But we also know, despite this fact that we've known for a very long time, that children with disabilities regularly get turned away from childcare, even though that's not allowed to happen per the American Disabilities Act. We know that there are certain childcare policies, programmatic policies, preschool policies, pre-K policies that unintentionally or intentionally discriminate against kids with disabilities. For example, potty training policies. How common is it that children are not allowed in a preschool setting or in a pre-K program if they're not potty trained? And we know that the developmental continuum of potty training varies, right? And it particularly varies for kids with disabilities, some of whom that happens for later, but that's an exclusionary policy. We know that more than half of kids with disabilities receive their services in segregated settings and more, and that number has likely increased during the pandemic. We know that it has increased during the pandemic. We also know that kids with disabilities are over-disciplined and they're overrepresented in suspension, expulsion, seclusion, and inappropriate restraint. So I want to zoom in on restraint and seclusion. I know we talk a lot about suspension and expulsion, but restraint and seclusion is another area where the disparity for kids with and without disabilities is severe and significant. Look at this chart on the right? This is restraint and seclusion rates for kids with disabilities. On the left, the 12% bar you see there, that's the percentage of K-12 kids under IDA who are getting services under IDA. So make up about 12% of the student body population, but they make up about 71% of restraints and 66% of seclusions. And just so we're clear, I know I didn't say this at the beginning, but a seclusion is where you lock a kid in a room by themselves without the ability to get out. So we know from federal data that 27,500 and 74,000, over 74,000 kids were secluded and restrained in a single school year alone. You know that looking at this, right? Kids with disabilities way overrepresented. We know that there's been investigative journalism and government accountability office reports looking into these issues and have found some really disturbing findings. This quote in orange here is from a government accountability office report that looked at restraint and seclusion in schools. And what they found, here's one example of what they found in their investigation. They found that a boy with a learning disability in elementary school was locked into a seclusion room 75 times over a 6-month period for multiple hours at a time. And the reasons cited for the seclusion included whistling, slouching, and hand waving. How does this affect kind of what we're doing as mental health consultants? How are you thinking about discipline and harsh discipline broadly, right? Including suspension, expulsion, but including these other things that are happening in our communities and that are disproportionately happening to our kids with disabilities and to others. And when we look at race and disability, the intersection between race and disability, which we should be doing, how does this look for Black children with disabilities, considering that we know Black children are already overrepresented in across every discipline category? How does that influence your priorities? How does it influence your workforce? How does it influence your focus on policy and what questions you're asking in the places where you're providing services? So let's think a little bit about dual language learners now. We know that DLLs, sorry, I just saw a question in the chat. Oh, all right. We know that DLLs bring a host of linguistic, cultural, social, familial strengths to the table. We also know, though, that we lack bilingual staff across the board, right? Frontline staff in terms of basically in every system where we operate, That means teachers, that means pediatricians, that means home visitors, as well as consultants, right, in the consultation workforce. And that can get in the way of the teacher-child and the teacher-family relationship or consultant-family relationship. We already talked about that the fact that the vast majority of instruction still happens in English, despite the fact that we have a huge population of dual language learners in this country. We know that assessment is a huge issue with children routinely assessed exclusively in English, which does not capture what they know and what they can do. And it sets everything off in the wrong direction. We know that English immersive environments can affect children's sense of belonging, their feelings of competence, their feelings of cultural pride, their confidence walking in to a program, their positive racial socialization, their bilingualism, right? And their ability to continue to communicate with their families and extended families. And we know that there are a host of external factors, societal factors, affecting wellness in this population. We know xenophobia, certainly anti-Latino, anti-Asian, anti-Indigenous, and Black hate. All of these things permeate, right, the experiences of young children, and they feel them, right? And so how do all of these different issues and more, right, these aren't exhaustive, it's just a sampling. How do these affect your work? How do they affect your process, your workforce, your focus, your priorities? And what questions are we asking in the places where we're working to really get at some of these issues? Here, now let's think about kind of the unique experiences of Black children and children from other racialized communities. So I already mentioned kind of the relationship piece. We know that there's also research that finds that teachers are less likely to have empathy for different race children. We know that there are lower expectations for dual language learners. We know that teachers are more likely to think that their class is too hard for Black children, even when we control for family's income, prior test scores, homework completion, for everything else. We know that teachers are less likely to refer Black and brown children to gifted and talented education, and more likely to refer them to special ed. So all of these issues, right, affect relationships. They affect the climate of the classroom. They affect, families and their partnerships. And so as we're thinking about consultation, as we're thinking about kind of our role in shifting policy change from the programmatic level to the local level to the state level to the national level, how are we considering all of these pieces and the different issues that all of our kids are facing as we move forward? So I know there's been a lot of focus already on suspension expulsion, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this because you've seen these data. As I mentioned, Black children are overrepresented across the board. And we know that that really hasn't changed a lot over time. In fact, it hasn't changed in like the 40 years that there's been data on this. Despite a whole lot of policy movement on suspension expulsion, I think the challenge with all the policy movement and suspension expulsion, where it's fallen short, is that it hasn't targeted closing disparities in expulsion and suspension. It's focused on reducing the rate. And so the rate of pre-K expulsion and suspension has actually dropped substantially between the last two data collection periods. But the racial disparity, which has not been the target of much policy at all, has remained basically the same. And so again, when we go in thinking about, it's not just let's address suspension expulsion. No, it's let's address how this is disproportionately affecting Black children and children with disabilities and other children of color, depending on what your data say. And it bears repeating, right? I'm sure you've heard this too, right? I know that as people who focus on mental health and on social emotional development, we often talk about challenging behavior being the root of harsh discipline, right? And certainly there is a lot of challenging behavior out there, especially after the pandemic, for sure. But what we need to be clear about when we talk about the overrepresentation of Black children in harsh discipline is that there's no credible evidence that finds that they actually behave worse. They don't. They don't behave worse. They don't have more intense behaviors. They don't have more severe behaviors. They don't behave worse, but yet they're overrepresented over here. So what is explaining that difference? We also know that income does not explain racial disparity. A thing we hear often is like, oh, children of color are overrepresented in low-income communities, and then that's so they behave worse because of that. It's really, well, when we control for income, race still comes out as a significant factor. I know you heard from Dr. Gilliam earlier this week, and some of his research is he found kind of 3 risk factors associated with children being suspended and expelled, and he calls them the 3 Bs. Being big, so in a classroom of 3 and 4-year-olds, the 4-year-olds are generally taller. Being Black, and being a boy. So when we pause and think about our work as mental health consultants, right? What do those 3 things have to do with challenging behavior? And what do they have to do with the perceptions of challenging behavior? So if we're walking into programs just wanting to address challenging behavior and we're ignoring the perception of challenging behavior and the racism embedded within those perceptions, then we're not doing our job, and we're doing a huge disservice to Black children and other children of color who may be disproportionately experiencing unjustly and unwarrantedly these sorts of punishments. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on corporal punishment, but it is legal. So is seclusion. I saw a question in the chat. Seclusion is legal in many states in the country. There's actually very few limitations on it in many states in the country. We have a map on that, but we didn't include it in this presentation. But if you look at our Start with Equity report, there's more information about where it's legal and where it's not and what those limitations are. Corporal punishment is legal in 19 states in public schools, and it's legal in every state in the country except for 2 in private schools. And it is happening, including to children in pre-K settings, which is the only place we have the data. We don't have the data in childcare. We don't have the data in other early care and education settings. We have the data starting in pre-K moving up. We know that, as you see here, Black children much more likely to be the subjects of corporal punishment than white children. I'm sorry, we don't have Indigenous children in here, but in many states, they are significantly overrepresented in corporal punishment, which leads back to, has roots back, right, in the painful and horrendous policy of boarding schools and the abuse that happened there in those education systems. We know the children with disabilities much more likely than kids without disabilities, and we know boys much more likely than girls to experience this form of punishment. So when we step back, right, let's get back to our hats as mental health consultants and consultation systems and addressing all of these issues. How is the content and process of consultation addressing these issues specifically for all of these groups of kids who are getting disproportionately worse experiences through a variety of issues, right? Through language, through content, through relationships, through discipline, through like all of these different pieces that we're talking about. Are we critically examining policy in the places where we provide consultation? Are we asking those questions, right? Are we asking to see the policy handbook? Are we providing advice and recommendations on that? Are we critically examining those with our equity lens? Is examining unique experiences, including the effects of racism, a core part of your model? Is that a thing you do in every case, right? Is that part of what every consultant is trained to do? Is that part of what they are supervised on? Is that part of what they are accountable to do? Is that part of what they're reporting? How do we account for language? And how do we account for language barrier where the consultant and the consultee might have a barrier, the consultee and the child might have a barrier? How are we equipping consultants with the knowledge to understand, specifically in the case where there's different language, different culture, like how do you form those relationships? And do we have competencies on doing that? How do we engage in conversations about racism and bias? And what specific de-biasing strategies are we using and equipping consultants with to go out in the field? And has to be mentioned, right? Like, how do we also promote joy and lift up the strengths of children from historically marginalized communities, right? My partner and my colleague from the CEP, Dr. Dariel Blevins, is often kind of talks about these two things, right? Like, we want to combat racism and we also want to promote joy, because the same child who is being expelled or suspended is the kid who is playing in the sprinklers, right? Like in their community and like experiencing joy. And we want to do both of those things. And so how do we hold both of those things up, and how do we equip our consultants to do that? And how do we identify issues uniquely affecting the experiences of all of these kiddos in the places where you work? And what about the workforce? I know if you've heard from Dr. Shivers earlier this week, I'm sure she focused a lot on this issue. So I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but really who is doing the work obviously deeply influences the work. Who are your consultees? I'm sorry if you hear my dog and children screaming downstairs, they're fine. Who are the families that they serve and who are the consultants? Is there a match? Is there a mismatch? And why is there a mismatch if there is? How are we trying to change that? Is there a plan to change that? I know the CoE has come out with several resources on hiring and onboarding, and we've tried to infuse an equity lens on that and prioritizing the diversification alongside the expansion of the mental health consultation workforce. Have we examined inequities within your own workforce, right? In terms of power and position dynamics, in terms of pay gaps? We know certainly that there's a racial pay gap in the early care and education space specifically, let alone kind of broadly at a national level. So as we think about these things in the workforce and we think about HR and we think of all these other dimensions and processes in our systems, it's important to take that equity lens. So I'm going to pause now for one more share in the chat, for another share in the chat moment where we can think through and share some concrete actions that you engage in to ensure fair, positive experiences within mental health consultation. And what are some concrete actions you engage in to ensure fair, positive experiences across early childhood services in general in the communities in which you work? So I'm going to ask Crystal to join me again to share out some of the chat.
Great, thank you, Shantel. It looks like the 30 seconds has popped up. People are now seeing in the chat the questions. So again, what are some concrete actions you engage in to ensure fair, positive experiences within IECMHC? And then what are some concrete actions you engage in to ensure fair, positive experiences across early childhood services in the communities in which you work? No answers yet, but I can recap a couple of comments we've had in the chat since you've talked until we get some. A lot of people, one person asked the question about seclusion and folks have been giving that person guidance on their own knowledge around it. People are saying no worries about fur babies. It makes us think that you are professional and normal. Love this presentation. And it looks like we have some responses coming up. One person said, engaging from a perspective of cultural humility, stay curious. Another individual says, speaking to the children in their native language. The first step is naming that implicit bias is happening at the center. One person said, Indiana is working on an endorsement reflective supervision in Spanish and ASL without the use of translators. Zeth says, language understanding of culture and also representation.
All right, should we keep going?
Yeah, let's keep going, but feel free to continue to drop your responses in the chat and interact with one another. We'll keep the presentation going. Thanks, Shantel.
Thank you so much, Crystal. And thank you all for your thoughts and your ideas. So let's focus to that third dimension that we talked about, is outcomes. So what does our system look like today? I'm not gonna harp on this too much because we hear it on Ausium, right? We know that there are disparities in outcomes across a range of different outcomes, health, wellness, academic, that are predicted by income, race, language, disability. And in case it's not clear, right, it is not the income, race, language, or disability that is causing these disparities. It is the racism, right, the ableism, right, the xenophobia, like all of these things that are causing the disparities. It is the policies starting from before the founding of the nation that have a really clear and straight line to the policies of today that are causing these disparities. So we know that history compounded current inequitable access to resources, lower quality and unfair experiences in systems drive many of these inequities. So let's just jump right into how mental health consultation can address that. Like, how can we target these as priorities and outcomes that we are accountable for and that we are measurably moving, right? By focusing thinking about how we focus on the first two, right? Because we know the first two, the access and experience pieces, affect the outcomes pieces. So when we see these differences in outcomes, we have to go back to the access and to the experiences and figure out where we're messing up as systems leaders, right? Where we can improve the policies that are in place, the practices that are going on that are influencing or contributing to these differences in outcomes. And always with that mindset, right? Of like changing systems, not changing children or families. Like we're not, again, like let's think about the fish that we talked about before, right? It's really changing the entire environment and the systems and making sure that that is part of our job, that is part of our task. What outcomes is your program accountable for across all levels, right? Is narrowing disparities a goal? Are you measuring that? How do you track disparities back to policy and back to practice and back to your consultation? Is data disaggregation and infusing equity in continuous quality improvement standard? Is that standard practice? Is that something you always do? Is that infused in all the data you collect, in all of the reflections that you have? How do you talk with programs about tracking and addressing disparities? Is that a tool that your consultants have that they are bringing to the places in which they work? Are we equipping them, right, with the tools and the knowledge and the resources to be able to have a conversation about policy? When a program wants to talk about this particular kid is causing issues, like how do you take that and open up a broader conversation about the policy handbook, about the practices, about the culture, about the environment? Like, are we being skilled with all of those different pieces, right? Not just narrowly looking at this particular kid, but like, how do we cause and promote change across the system? How do we ensure that these conversations, again, focus on systems, professional development, policy change, not on changing children and families? So with that in mind, that was a quick one, but let's go ahead and share in the chat one more time. What are some concrete actions that you're engaging in to close racial and other disparities in outcomes? And I'd encourage you here to, again, think specifically. We often are tempted to just talk in generalities as like general solutions to close racial disparities. But as I gave in my example earlier, if we just address suspension and expulsion generally, or just reducing the rate in general, that doesn't do anything to actually close the disparity. So I'd encourage us, when we think about solutions to closing these disparities, to think about solutions that get at these disparities in a really targeted way. So on the second question, right, what are some concrete actions you engage in to close racial and other disparities in outcomes across, again, the early childhood services in the systems in which you work? So I'll hand it back to Crystal.
Thanks, Shantel. So yes, in the chat, I've added the question, as well as on the screen. We are answering the question that's shown on the screen. Looks like no answers just yet, but we'll give folks a bit of time to respond. We do have a comment here, Shantel. Someone asked in the chat if other people are experiencing burnout, and some folks are responding to one another saying they are experiencing burnout during the pandemic. Okay, we have an answer here. One concrete action is providing access to services regardless of insurance, private Medi-Cal, no insurance. Our program allows those children to receive mental health services. Additional person access to transportation services, telehealth services. Education is a must. Expanding services to family, friend, and neighbor care, yes. And then one person just wrote, I make sure to stay brave and don't shy away from difficult conversations. When I think bias is an issue, I lead with that in my discussions with staff. Somebody wrote, meet the race where they are and find what they need. Hopefully that makes sense, Alicia said. Johanna says, provide specific trainings for staff teachers to address the disparities, social emotional focused training, childhood trauma training, family strengthening, past free preschool for all, investment in MHC and coaches to support teachers, staff, and home centers, data collection. Right now, we don't even track data in a meaningful way across ECE settings. Somebody gave that a thumbs up. Create regular and ongoing forum for ECMHC funders and others devoted to discussing and cultivating racial equity in the settings where ECMHC is occurring, and starting discussions on how to track disparities back to policy and professional development. And that's a good amount of the ones that are captured.
Yeah, that's such good engagement. Thank you all so much for all of your input and engagement. I think in staying true to this equity frame, right, I would just continue to challenge us to like keep that in your head, right? Like, where are we identifying general solutions to this very specific problem, and how can we drill down even further? If we're providing mental health consultations regardless of insurance status, right, like that is a really great and important start, but are we explicitly reaching out to the folks that we know are underinsured, right, to like bring them in, right? Universal pre-K, I'm a huge advocate. All of us are on the same page. UPK is really important. It's a really important service. And also, we know that there are already disparities within the experiences kids are getting, and inequities in the experiences and disparities in outcomes from the pre-K that we do have. So what are we doing specifically in expanding UPK to change that, to address those differential experiences? So just constantly thinking about how we take these universal ideas and drill down even more specifically to target those disparities. So I wanted to kind of getting close to closing, just kind of again lift this issue up, lift this kind of description of an equitable system in which we can all operate and work, and we all have a role to play, including mental health consultants and especially mental health consultation systems. And so I wanted to share this graph, one of these graphs in closing. Again, if you've seen any of the CoE, CEP webinar series, you're familiar with this graph. But we know that mental health consultations operate in a lot of systems. I've admittedly focused a lot on early care and education. But of course, right, we operate in lots of places, in child welfare, in homelessness shelters, in domestic violence shelters, in pediatric care, and there's a whole number of different settings where mental health consultants and consultation systems operate. But here, this graph is from the Racial Equity Institute out of North Carolina. And what it's graphing is the likelihood of having a bad outcome compared to white people in the United States, right? That red line is African Americans, the black line is white people. And what we see is, right, these black blocks at the bottom, we have health, and then we have a few outcomes from health. For example, infant death and death from diabetes. We have education, we have criminal and legal, we have child welfare, we have finance, and then we have some more specific indicators. And the first thing you might notice is that the red line is kind of zigzagging, right? Which indicates that there are some differences in the magnitude of the difference, depending on the particular outcome we're looking at. But what you might also notice is that the red and the black lines never change positions. There is never a case or an outcome on this graph, right, where you see that the red line goes below the black line. The red line is above the black line across the board, right? And this is kind of the illustration of the groundwater, right? Each of these black boxes is the lake, right? And the groundwater, right, is the thing that is contaminating all of these things. Policies, historical policies, right, from way before our founding that follow us today, that have just evolved and look a little bit differently, but are still exclusionary and discriminatory today. And so as we think about the different systems in which we operate, I encourage you to go through the same process, right? Ask the same questions about access, about experiences, about outcomes. When we think about all of the different systems where we operate, we see a lot of the same patterns, right? And so we can apply this access, experiences, and outcomes frame kind of across the board to all of these different places. And ultimately, right, it's about who we serve, regardless of what system you're operating in, how we serve them, right? And what experiences we're promoting for them through our consultation indirectly. And what are the results of our services? And what are the results of the results of the programs, right? Where kids are being served and where we are consulting. So I'll just close with a picture of my nephew, but just with the emphasis here that change must be systemic. That includes policies. It must be actionable. Often we just kind of talk about equity. There's been a lot of talk about equity. That's good, but we have to be concrete about it, and we have to be measurable and actionable about it. It must be wide ranging. We talked about the workforce. We talked about data. We talked about practice. We talked about policies and leadership. And there has to be accountability tied to it. Because if American history has taught us anything, it's just not going to happen out of the goodness of all of our hearts. Like there has to be some accountability tied to it. And this exists across all, right? When we say it's got to be wide ranging, we have these different dimensions of mental health consultation that we focus on: programs or models, equity, workforce, policy, funding, right? It has to exist, and we have to do this type of analysis across the board on all these different pieces. So I'll leave you kind of with before I share some resources, with this, right? What are we doing about the groundwater? What are we doing about the lake? What are we doing about the fish? Again, we talked a lot about the groundwater, and we talked mostly about the lake. The fish is really critical work as well. And we don't want to undermine that, right? But that can't be all we're doing, because we're never gonna clean up the lake or the groundwater if that's all we're doing. And fish are gonna continue to go belly up. So action across all three of these levels is part of our job, right? As leaders in the mental health consultation system, and it's essential and it's urgent. So before I let you go, just a few resources to direct you to, most of which are on the CoE website. We have an equity toolkit on there that Dr. Shivers and the CEP team developed several months ago. That is there for folks to access. We had a webinar series on equity that was very rich and really dives into several different communities that you should check out. We have the competencies, the mental health consultation competencies. The CEP, in partnership with the CoE, reviewed all the competencies, did a deep dive on it, and embedded equity across all of the different competencies. And so if we're operating and using those competencies to prepare and develop and to kind of have as the standard where we're going for our workforce, we are embedding equity in that. And of course, several of the CEP reports that I've referenced today, you can find on the CEP website, which I think has been shared on the link. Yeah, and with that, I will hand it back to Neil and stop sharing.
Yeah, well, I'm bummed that you're going to stop sharing, because as I sat and listened, I was struck by a number of things, as I always am when you talk, Shantel, and in particular when you showed your nephew, because I look at that REI graph and say, look, it looks across the same. It's easy to just sort of look at a graph and then to be reminded this is about children within those systems and families within those systems. I said this when you started, and you proved me right. You don't let people off the hook, right? You started with, I think, a line that I hope people listen to, which is we need to break the links between demography and destiny. And I think it's a great way to think about it. And then you challenged everybody by asking things about how, and talking about how does mental health consultation, how can mental health consultation, and really trying to get folks to drill down and not talk, but act. And so I hope all of you have been as inspired as I always am. Shantel doesn't know that. I usually just make stupid jokes with her, but she does sort of do such amazing work, and I really do appreciate it. And sort of thinking about access, experiences, and outcomes. Hopefully you're leaving here thinking about how this applies to you, to your system, to your community, tribal, nation, state, territory. We're not going to let you go, Shantel. You think they're going, but I'm going to turn it over to Crystal, who's going to introduce our mindful moment. But Shantel, just a million times thanks. Just always amazing, and really appreciate it. So I'm going to turn it over to Crystal for a mindful moment.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you, Chantel, for that wonderful presentation. I've been thinking, breath is radical. Be impeccable with your word. Accountability needs to be tied to the work that we do. These are things that we've heard throughout these past few days. And so I'm very excited to welcome our final mindful moment presenter for today before you go off into your next couple of sessions. I'll just go ahead and read his bio. Want to make sure you are on. Okay, great, TJ. TJ and I are Achieving Whole Wellness coaches for the National Asian American Pacific Islander Mental Health Association, in addition to the hat I wear here as program specialist. And 2 years ago, right before the pandemic hit, we went to New Mexico, where SAMHSA holds an annual conference teaching communities of color to train wellness coaches in order to serve their communities. And so really happy to have TJ on today as a fellow wellness coach, but also a spoken word artist. So I'm gonna read his bio, gonna let you, TJ, introduce yourself and end with the spoken word mindful moment practices that you will be sharing with us today. And so here's your bio. TJ Simba-Medel, they is an award-winning poet, teaching artist, activist, and proud Filipino. He is a 2009 Southern Fried Individual Poetry Slam champion in the South. He holds a bachelor's in theaters from the University of Arkansas in Little Rock. He is the first Filipino-American faculty member of Second City, Chicago, the first Filipinx-American DEI facilitator for Second City Works B2B, and is the recipient of the 27th Second City Jim Zilovec Award for Community Excellence. Before he left Chicago, he produced the National Poetry Slam in 2018 and was featured on CNN Philippines for his work with the Manila Improv Festival. Since returning to Bryant, Arkansas, he has become the first Filipinx-American faculty member of Arkansas Repertoire Theater, the first Filipinx-American to hold a seat in the Citizens First Congress on behalf of Arkansas Youth Coalition for Social Change, and he is an active board member of the Arkansas Philippine Association. His most recent collaborations have all been virtual because of the pandemic, and they have been with various organizations such as the Lawson Center at the University of California, Davis, the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center, the Philippine Veterans Recognition Education Project, Filipinos at Amazon, the Philippine Embassy in Washington, D.C., and the Filipino Young Leaders Program. So very excited for your spoken word set. I'm gonna just leave it to you, TJ, and enjoy, everyone.
Question. My hand is raised for a purpose. It'll hurt us if you don't reply to my call. Ooh, so reply to my why before my hand starts to fall. Question. My hand isn't resting on a stand for support. It's being held high with my arms starting to contort. A voice not heard, an incomplete word. Mr. and Mrs. Teacher, I want to be a preacher. A feature for the class for 1 second. I beckon for you to hear my voice and for you to ignore it. It's just not a choice. Question. Gravity is taking its toll on my 206 outstretched bones. Trying to get your attention with my limb suspension is only turning out to be nothing but a reality of slavery. My freedom of speech chained because you haven't called on my name. My right to have spoken, stripped from my thoughts, I'm choking in silence, my throat all in knots, I cough. You look at me as if misplaced. A puzzled face as to why you seem to erase my raised hand from your face. Question, is it because you don't want to hear my mouth? I try to shout what I'm about, but you ignore my call outs. You ignore me sitting at my desk near the door. What for? You know what? I don't need your help. I'll just figure this stuff out by myself. And when you see me struggle, then maybe you'll juggle the decision that has clouded your vision. You teacher, me student, I ask question, but you ruining it. So question. Now my question is an answer. So now I'll transfer my thoughts onto you. Direct my question as an opinion for you. Or more like a statement. You can try to escape it, but I don't think my thoughts can be debated. And since you seem to ignore my wish to be heard, then Mr. and Mrs. Teacher, call on me, please. My hand's been raised for a while. I have some answers for some questions on trial. I'm here like everyone else is, and I'll be clear like no one else is. And if you think for just 1 minute that I'm in my desk just to sit in it, you're wrong. I have a question, and it won't be kept. And if you still don't see me, that's all right. I'll just switch to my left. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and grand rising to everyone. I know I can't see you, but you can see me, and it feels good to see and be seen. I appreciate and am honored to share space with y'all. I'm gonna go in and get out, and I'm just gonna keep going. Time is a non-renewable resource. We can't get it back. We can only move forward. So I am very appreciative of the time we were spending together, and I hope that the words that I share with y'all is worth the time. About halfway between my mental stability and mental recovery is where my legal insanity lies. It's like this zany, cartoony, Saturday morning Family Matters sitcom, watching Bill Nye burn the world with a blowtorch, telling me that the world is on fire. It's with safety glasses on and bulletproof book bags. I visit schools the same way I go to movie theaters, in fear. As you can hear my dog in the background, we're all too scared to take a seat and recline, unwind, watch a Black Little Mermaid change times. I see an Asian flick with just Asians in it. It's kind of crazy how rich Asians are portrayed when I know that colonization keeps the islands of the Philippines enslaved. But hey, I know where my exits are in case 17-year-old Kyle has an AR-15 on display. About halfway between my mental stability and mental recovery is where my legal insanity lies. Frown faces and the laces of gray foreheads, all shown at the roots of racists. Your hate's on display when the spray tans get washed away. My silence is a point for the oppressor to shave. I stick out like a severed finger in a home-cooked stew. I may read like chicken soup for the privileged soul, but it tastes like, ramen noodles with the expiration date long overdue. I look at every miss like a steak, ring-fingered pieces of meat, and animals need to eat. Fish are our friends, not food. My first 12 steps is to look in the mirror and slut-shame the predator in you. Dissect every single interaction and examine through the fraction. What I did over what I've done equals the reciprocal of what better as a male can I do. About halfway between my mental stability and mental recovery is where my legal insanity lies. I tell all my students to give more of it when I myself am on the brink of all of the quit. But nobody is stopping me from a glass of wine, watching my favorite Disney movie, I don't know, like 75 times, Peter Pan and Hercules, Moana and Coco, self-care to unwind. My happy thoughts go from zero to hero when I wonder how far I'll go with this proud corazon. Anything great is worth going through self-hate, but the debate is how much can I take? How much hate can I take when I take all these L's, these losses all by myself? All I want is a chance to be the rapper, but I butter spread the beef like Drake. Dive head first in the deep end, but it depends. Did the stuff I just do to myself depend these pens, these ends, defend and defriend these friends that descend when we go away to fix ourselves? Because everybody tells us to, but nobody ever tells us what the work is. They just tell you to, go work on yourself. So I just have to watch my favorite Disney movie, Coco, again, because fighting for a dream that even my family doesn't want me to be, while finding my identity inside of my ancestors I've never met, man, that's really hard to do. Day of the Dead is every day for me. COVID-19, natural flavors, concentrated. But I'm not driving down to a border to be someone's savior. Savor the flavor of ignorant behavior for as long as I can remember. Dementia, whoo, is a beverage best served with time. A blessing when you feel the trauma through a screen slaver. Watched Incredibles 2 because it's incredible to show where credit's due. Ooh, Elastigirl. You're so flexible. I don't own a birth canal, but I wish my brain would stretch like it do? Give birth to a thought that's been living in my head for 9 months, kicking and screaming, telling me, feed me, watch my feed me, your nightmares and dreams. Keep me up all hours of the night, wondering why can't I make any of this stuff right? Birthing an idea that I think might kill me. I mean, it ends up having to be the best thing to happen to me. No matter what choice I may make mistakes, but I'm not a mistake. About halfway between my mental stability and mental recovery is where my legal insanity lies. Where courage is just 20 seconds of unfathomable bravery. Some of the greatest things in life are on the other side of fear. I mean, you could post that hashtag for a popular motivational TikTok here, where each and every single one of your faces that I currently cannot see, because you know you're in a program that's separated between us and Zoom, but you know we're still in the same room. Yeah, each one of the spaces that we share is kind of like that hanging cat poster. You know that one where it's telling you to, hey, hang in there. Meow. I am the living embodiment of what my parents feared, the unknown, the child they can't control. I am not responsible for the projections you see through, but I must communicate that being not okay is something really hard to do. And it's okay to say I'm not okay. And for that day to be today. To be 2 days, to be 2 days, to be more days, to be all the days. I am pushing clown to the forefront because we cry enough. Screen rolling. Voices are polling. Wondering how much fear for my life I have, more than I used to. Wondering if I should call my friends who've been shot at too. Am I ready to be the body armor for the kids at my schools? About halfway between my mental stability and mental recovery is where my legal insanity lies. I mean, but my parents, they would say, he does poetry. Thank you. Yeah. I guess we'll just keep going, right? My dreams are undocumented. No recollection. They only come to me in pieces. You could say my dreams have poor connection. My dreams get rug pulled from underneath me. It's just dreams. They're just dreams. I mean, that's what my family tells me. Who reads into them? Who reads into sleep like that? Is there a ministry of napping that holds your unconscious accountable for the types of dreams we should be having? My dreams are my dreams. They're things I manifest, like destiny. Master the sweat in the technique. A soft web dev's clinique, big three. My dreams, they come in trinities. I've got no boundaries or borders. My dreams build back better. Build, 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 but empty evictions lie to me with no vacancy, and y'all obviously have room, but it's just a homeless shelter's dream. My dreams, I mean, they're the least. Less than, not even a dash underneath any factor of being seen. See my dreams, my dreams lie down vertically. It's not my dream to be working on me and what makes me whole all the time. I mean, that's me on top of me, on top of me, on top of me. That's the dream that seems to be. That's where I draw the line. And my dreams, they wait in line. I mean, my dreams wait in line like the DMV. Hold the line between democracy and anarchy. When are we going to move forward with these dreams? I've got dreams to be complete. I'm done talking. I'm going off camera. This is TJ and I'm wishing to be complete. They're just dreams, y'all. They're just dreams. I don't care for nightmares. I nurse them with my bed underneath. In my head, my dreams are dead in defeat. Skull crossbones emoji. Dreams show me a Texas-sized amount of hate. The stars at night are big and bright, deep in the heart of racists. Woo! My dreams get deported, caged, chased, beat, gunned down, silenced, hydrated, dehydrated. These dreams. They have these unfinished walls that I put up around my boundaries. All these thoughts, they seem to be getting in, and I'm asking myself, are all thoughts welcome here? Why can all advice come into me legally? Which feelings do I deport back to my bloodline and ancestry? It's my dream to be unique, but not when it gets hunted down by pillow sheets that only see my dreams as a threat to my sleep. I'm a dreamer. I'm a dreamer whose dream act is to dream. But my dreams, they go undocumented because they have poor connection. Late at night, when all the world is sleeping, I stay up. And when I can't sleep, I dream. I dream. I dream. I dream of you. Thank you so much for allowing me to share this space with you. Thank you so much for having me, and be safe. And don't forget to dream. Thank you.
Thank you, TJ. So many hearts, snaps, claps in the chat. Just gonna leave it at that. Thank you all so much for joining us in this session, and looking forward to seeing you all in the next.